Starting notes on chapter 13, section 2. The topic that we are starting to cover today is the slave trade. All right, so slavery had been practiced in Africa since ancient times. The primary market for slaves was Southeast Asia, where most slaves were used as domestic servants. I think that's a thing to note. It is important. I think when we learn American history, when we learn our history, we become very it's a bad way to say it, but egocentric. We only think of ourselves, right? Like everything stops and starts with American history. It doesn't. History's been going on a lot longer than American history. America has only been around, 250-ish years, right? Like not a long time in the scheme of the world, in the scheme of all history. And so I think it's unfair to not recognize, because I think it again teaches the truth of the atrocities of slavery. I always teach slavery kind of this way when I talk about it. Since the dawn of man, there has always been one person over another person. Does that make sense? Usually, when one person has power over another, it does not end well for the person that is under the power. Make sense? So, kind of stick with that in your brain. Don't get lost in, it only happened in America. I think that belittles how awful slavery is. Make sense? If we only think that it happened in one country, I think it belittles it. I think if we acknowledge that it has happened everywhere, that makes us go, whoa, maybe we should recognize and do a little more to make sure that never happens again, or that we stop how it is happening today, because slavery does still exist today, right? Did we know that? Did we not know that? Where does slavery exist today? Somebody tell me. Raise your hand, talk to me. Anybody, go. China. There is some enslavement in China. Yeah, absolutely. Where else? How about something that, anybody wear Nikes in here? I do. I love Nikes, right? I have tons of pairs of them, right? Yeah, I see. I complimented yours as you walked in today. How about a sweatshop, right? We probably joked about this a little bit before, like, I get my Nikes cheaper, but, we, not jokingly, but really think about how much you pay for your shoes, how much they're actually made for. Where are they making the shoes? If they're being made in another country for cheaper and those people are only making a little bit of money, that's slavery, right? It isn't as slavery that we might think of it, but it is enslavement, okay? They're making a nickel, a quarter, whatever a day, and then all of a sudden I'm buying a pair of Nikes for $300. Where's all that money going? Not to the people that were making them, not to the people that were, in trouble in another country where they're building them, making them. Make sense? All right, so let's keep rolling. So, slavery also existed in some European countries. The demand for slaves increased dramatically with the discovery of the Americas in the 1490s. So you might see a question that asks that. What caused the demand for slavery to go up exponentially? During the 16th century, plantations that grew sugarcane were set up in Brazil and on the islands in the Caribbean. Growing sugarcane requires much labor. African slaves were shipped to Brazil and the Caribbean to work on these plantations. So what caused this uprising, this larger population of slaves? The exploration of America, and then sugarcane farming, right? Very, very labor intensive, not easy, and they wanted cheap labor, right? The way you make more money, it's even today. If I have a company and I want to keep more money in my pocket, I hire younger people, right? Because I can pay younger people what? Less money. They're cheap labor, right? Do we understand that? It's just the reality. Even in my profession as a teacher, as teachers get older, they make more money, right? That's just, it's our contracts. So at some point in my career, I will be worth what they pay me. They could pay 2 teachers. So when I retire, they're like, whew, got him off the books. We can pay. Do you understand? So this concept of cheap labor it's still in existence today, but slave labor is the cheapest form of labor. They're not paying them anything. All right. So again, they're taking advantage of a people. In 1518, a Spanish ship carried the first boatload of slaves directly from Africa to the Americas. During the next 2 centuries, the trade in slaves grew dramatically and became part of, underline, triangular trade. Triangular trade. My son actually just came home from elementary school and was talking to me about this. I was surprised that their teacher was talking about it. In the triangular trade system, European ships carried manufactured goods such as guns, cloth to Africa, where they traded for a cargo of slaves. So you're going to want to underline this. Maybe off to the side, draw that triangle, and you can draw what went where. Does that make sense? All right, you know your writing, and it's pretty simple to break it down if you pay attention to what I'm saying. So in the triangular trade system, European ships carried manufactured goods like guns and cloth to Africa. They traded those for slaves. So Africa got what? Guns and cloth, right? Then these boats picked up slaves. The slaves were shipped to the Americas and sold. All right? And when they made it to the Americas and sold these slaves, they then bought tobacco, molasses, and sugar and cotton and brought those to Europe. Do we see the three different areas? All right? Do we understand how that triangular trade worked? Any questions about triangular trade, how it worked? So Africa got what? Guns, cloth, right? Then the Americas got the slaves. And then Europe, that's the one that's kind of the middleman in all of this. After they sold the slaves, they bought sugar, molasses, those kind of things, cotton, brought those back to Europe. Make sense? That's that. Okay, so as many as, this is awful, as many as 10 million African slaves were brought to the Americas between the early 16th and late 19th centuries. So that's a massive number. The journey from Africa to the Americas became known as, underline, the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage. So think about the triangle. It's the second part of the trip, right? All right, so the Middle Passage, the middle. It's pretty simple to remember. So many slaves died on the journey. Those who arrived often died because they had little or no immunity to diseases. Okay, so this Middle Passage, I think, is a time during slave trade that is very minimally talked about when we're learning history. All right? I think it is a time that should be talked about. Why? Because how I started the class was understanding the horrificness of what? Slave trade. The Middle Passage was the time when the slaves were shoved into slave ships, right? It's not like they were on a cruise. And when I say these things, I'm not trying to belittle any of this. Trust me. If you haven't heard the seriousness of how I teach this, then it's been lost on you. But I think when people think of slave ships and like the slaves being brought over to the Americas, they think of like, well, they were just on a ship, like coming across the ocean. Well, let's break that down a little bit. They weren't in rooms, right? They didn't have their own beds. They were shoved into the bottom of ships like cargo. Most of the time overcrowded, right? Most of it. Think about the number that I told you, 10 million in those, years that we talked about. On top of each other. Bathrooms, non-existent, really. So where was that happening, right? Just in your brain, think about this, right? Had Africans, were they seafaring people? Were Africans out on the ocean a lot? No. Anybody ever been out on the ocean ever? Have you guys ever been out on a boat ever? How's that? You ever get seasick? Yep. Have you? How's that? Is that fun?
When I used to go on cruises when I was younger.
Uh-huh.
A lot of my family isn't good with especially the ocean.
Yeah.
And there was a big storm we went through one of the last nights.
Yep.
And we were at the most fancy restaurant on the boat.
Yep.
And then only 3 of us ate there because everyone else had to leave because they either were sick or they're so nauseous they had to
Yeah.
sleep.
If you've never been out on the ocean or a big body of water that has waves of some currents of some sort, being seasick is not fun, right? It's awful. It's one of the worst experiences. I've had it. It's right, throwing up to the point that you are throwing up bile out of your stomach. Again, where's that throw up going? Same spot that the other stuff's going that's coming out of their bodies. That's how you get sick. That's how you get disgustingly sick, right? Bile, these kind of things. A lot of people died because they weren't eating. When you were sick, you didn't get fed then. See, when we think about when you get sick, mommy and daddy and grandpa and grandma and aunt and uncle and everybody wants to do what to you? They want to take care of you. They want to make you feel better, don't they? If you got sick on a slave ship, you were a problem. You didn't get fed. They wanted to feed the strong. Why? Because they could make more money on the strong. The sickly didn't make them money. Bye-bye. A lot of times they were thrown overboard. Not killed and then thrown overboard, just thrown overboard. to die. You understand? So the Middle Passage was an atrocious part of slave trade that I think is glossed over a lot. There's a movie that we'll watch in here. I show it every year. The state of New Jersey in the past couple years has really made a push with this, not with the movie particularly, but with the subject matter, and that's called Amistad. It is based on a true story about a ship called La Amistad. They're called the Amistad slaves. It was a major pivotal moment in slave trade and the eventual downfall of slave trade, thank God. But it shows it's probably one of the best depictions on film that I've ever seen of the Middle Passage. Pretty hard to watch. And I'll talk about that again when we show the movie, but it was a great movie that came out long time ago. A lot of good actors. You'll know some of the actors. Won an Oscar. It had some Oscar winners in it. Was made by Steven Spielberg. I'm sure we've heard of Steven Spielberg, right? Big names. I think when it first came out, this school actually took the entire one class history department and rented out a movie theater and went and saw it. So we will watch that at some point. But again, when I talk about the Middle Passage, I want you guys to understand it is something that I don't think is talked about or taught about enough. I think we think slaves were these poor people were kidnapped, which they weren't. They were kidnapped by their own people, if you want to call it that, put onto a ship in an awful way, and then they were just here. They just got here. That's not how it went down. It was pretty awful. And a lot of them died. And then when a lot of them got here, guess what happened? They got sick and died here because they weren't used to here or South America, right? They weren't used to the diseases here. And so a lot more died that way, tragically. All right, so pretty awful time. I'm going to stop there.